Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by WealthManagement.com Senior Editor David Lenok.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of WealthManagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to their more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that can just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. To learn more about estate planning and how you can better serve your clients, visit wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our monthly journal features tax law updates, wealth planning, retirement planning, and much more, written by thought leaders in the industry. That's wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our guest today is George Stefanou. George is a Forbes top next-gen wealth advisor. He draws inspiration from his Greek immigrant father's journey, particularly the values of entrepreneurship, discipline, and financial independence. And in fact, his father's story is the inspiration for George's upcoming book, To Wealth: Investment, Tax, and Estate Strategies to Consider When Your Net Worth Exceeds $1 million. In the book, George draws from his personal and professional story to help individuals and families navigate the complexities of managing wealth, especially those who, like his father, built their fortunes from the ground up. Thanks so much for coming on, George.
Thank you, David.
The subject of today's episode is boxing legend Leon Spinks. Spinks was an American boxer who competed professionally from 1977 to 1995. Emerging from the behemoth Pruitt-Igoe housing project in North St. Louis, Spinks dropped out of high school and served 3 years in the Marine Corps before winning light heavyweight gold at the 1976 Summer Olympics alongside his brother Michael, who won the middleweight. In only his 8th professional fight, Leon won the undisputed heavyweight champion after defeating Muhammad Ali in a split decision, considered pretty much the biggest upset in boxing history up until Buster Douglas beat Mike Tyson. After the victory, the iconically gap-toothed Spinks memorably paid tribute to Ali, exclaiming, "He's still the greatest, I'm just the latest." Though he made millions during his boxing career, a combination of financial mismanagement and mounting brain injury caused Spinks to fall on hard times as his career wound down in the mid-'80s. At his lowest point in the early 2000s, Spinks was working as a janitor at a Nebraska YMCA while picking up shifts at McDonald's. Thankfully, Leon, with the assistance of wife Brenda, eventually moved to Las Vegas, a city where he remained a beloved figure, and settled into what he characterized as a comfortable life, before his eventual death from prostate cancer at age 67. George, though Leon Spinks managed to bounce back somewhat and have a happy ending, the cliche of those who spring from poverty and earn millions before eventually falling back into poverty again is enduring. In your book, you note that the real challenge isn't just accumulating wealth, but learning how to manage, enjoy, and sustain it for the long term. So what are some of the unique challenges faced by first-generation millionaires in this regard?
Well, I think there's that lack of education at the end of the day. They're taught to work hard, and that's the only way to accumulate some wealth is through the backbreaking of doing that or whatever raw talents like Leon had and others that you mentioned in your podcast. But really, the gap there and kind of the inspiration behind the book was there's lots of books out there on how to accumulate wealth, right? So how to become a millionaire, all these different facets and features and stories, but then not a whole lot about what to do once you've gotten there and how to do so efficiently, some of the blind spots that are out there. And what I find a lot, especially with first generation millionaires, especially first generation American millionaires, that is they bring that old country mentality here. They don't want to be seen as, because although they want to accumulate wealth, they want to be successful, that level of success and wealth sometimes attaches itself to a personality type that they don't identify with, do not consider themselves wealthy. I know my own father was taken aback a little bit by the term millionaire. And so that's why we kind of came up with the term affectionately what I call two commonwealth in the book. So that scarcity mindset, I think that giving themselves even permission to spend. So some squander it, as you said, especially if it comes quickly, tends to be in that celebrity set where you go from zero to the fast lane pretty quickly, whatever that release was or whatever that victory was that gets you top billings. But I would say the average American that built it the old fashioned way of just putting away little by little and saving and not spending, it's hard for them to then let that up and actually enjoy the fruits of their labor at the end of it all.
It's interesting that you use the term old country, because I think there is really a very interesting corollary here between, first generation wealth and first generation immigrants, especially in this country. Whereas that, obviously becoming a first generation billionaire is effectively the American dream, right? For regardless of where you're from. But also in that, whether you're coming from, say, Greece, an actual old country, or coming out of, like Leon did, the sort of the projects of St. Louis, nonetheless, you are kind of immigrating into a different lifestyle, and you are having to sort of take the values that were instilled in you, in your youth, and try to, mold them into this new life as you've sort of immigrated into wealth and sort of, learn a new language and all these sort of similar experiences.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you see that distinction there. And I think that's something that comes to play. I know in your podcast, you talked about in the past too, that idea of the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves really comes down to that education, right? So, that wealth being squandered along the way, but we see it even in immigrant families. Typically you're the next generation, or the first generation, American. So in my case, I was the first to attend a college, in fact, I think the first to ever attend middle school, much less high school, much less college, on my dad's side of the family. And he always instilled in me the opportunities that this country affords me because I was able to have an education. Whereas I think if we're here and we're depending on our background with things, if we're not encouraged to make the opportunities that are there, but instead acquire wealth, maybe again on a quicker basis, still plenty of work ethic, et cetera, when it comes to sports and entertainment and all those facets. However, it is a kind of a windfall that hits you. So similar with lotto winners, I think easy come, easy go, so to speak, even though it's not easy come. I don't want to take anything away from those celebrities that they certainly had hard earnings with it. But I think probably a bit of it also comes with the spotlight in there. And this idea of keeping up with the Joneses is even amplified in those arenas.
Is there, when you're dealing with first generation wealth creators specifically, you're talking about the value of education, and obviously, they're not going to get there without picking up some education on the way. But largely, these people who have this success are going to have, not gotten it by sort of following somebody else and following orders, but at a certain point they've broken out and, done it their way to sort of, to steal a line from Sinatra. There's a certain self-confidence and a certain, self-justification in sort of becoming a millionaire your way. Does that sort of get in the way of, if you're as an advisor sort of trying to okay, let's try to financially educate you in a certain way, when they're sort of like, oh, well, what I do works,
Yeah, I think that's valid. A lot of the wealth that's created in this country, for instance, is through business ownership, for instance. And so they've created something and they are the top dog, right? They get to call the shots. And so you have this alpha personality sometimes. They're not used to being told no. They're the implementers. They understand. They control the outcomes. But once they realize that wealth through perhaps an exit, it kind of changes, right? They're leaning on their advisors. And how does that go about? Well, I would tell you that it was really interesting. I was just at a summit and for the Exit Planning Institute. And they released a new finding from a study that they've done, and it was that of your most trusted advisors, and consistently it had always been your CPA was number one, or your tax advisor was number one most trusted advisor to business owners, and number 5 on the list was your financial advisor. And the most recent study actually showed that the financial advisor has moved into the first position and the CPA to the third position, and that is because the advice that's being given today is so much more. It's not just access to markets. It's not just some innovative investment strategies or whatnot, but it truly is that planning, that long-term and things that they can see tangibly, whether it's around taxes, around estates, around being conversation facilitators, along with quarterbacking the conversations with the estate planning attorneys, et cetera, and making sure that their family is onboarded and understands what's going on, and that we can actually make that wealth last for generations, and have a much higher multiple on their wealth, not just on their business, but facilitates all of that. So I thought that was pretty interesting finding, and so happy being an advisor that's been the case. And so hopefully through our day-to-day activities, through means like books and publications and podcasts, as this information is disseminated, hopefully that changes. I think sometimes we are in this career sadly we have this career available to us sadly because we teach a lot of things in this country, but personal financial wealth and planning is not one of them. And despite
you're not even supposed to talk about money in this country, right?
Yeah. Money, politics, religion, those are the things they're all
totally unimportant things that we should never talk about.
Yeah.
Well, I think what you're saying about financial advisors sort of becoming the most trusted is really borne out, I think, in the trends we're seeing in the industry as well. Right. Well, particularly as an estate planning, professional, I notice more and more that there is a push for financial advisors to sort of take the lead in the estate planning process in a way, which they may have been qualified to before, but they weren't sort of empowered to necessarily. But there is sort of this idea that, the lawyers really, the accountants, maybe they know where sort of like the worst bodies are buried. But in terms of like, who knows what's happening with the family and what's going on with the everyday life, the financial advisor is increasingly that person. And that, as you try to take on a more holistic, be it financial planning or estate planning tact, like that's the information that's actually more important than sort of the deep, dark secret a lot of the times.
Yeah. And that's why I talk about in the book is really to ensure that readers are finding financial advisors that are familiar with the industry, but also have that network of ancillary advisors that they collaborate with. The truth is, because we can pick up the phone and reach out to our clients at any point, because there's always market topics to talk about. There's always something going on, whether it's a movement, a tax situation, whatever it may be. Whereas when you think of your CPA, at the beginning of the year, as you have your 1099s come in or your W-2 or whatever it may be, your K-1s. Your estate planning, you almost never want to deal with, right? But something happened in the family, or a close friend has passed away and you realize, hey, I gotta do this. It's usually not something that's top of mind for you. Whereas the advisor bridges that gap. As they're doing reviews, if they're truly being holistic and comprehensive and doing their job, they're going to be the bridge to make sure that they're partnering with the accountant to look forward, not just backwards, to look with the estate planning attorney to make sure that they're going to know the dynamics of the family that just comes up in conversation. And it's really interesting, I'd say, even from a family mindset, as you work with old generations as they age and get older. And I think the statistics show that one of the fastest growing populaces in the U.S. is centenarians, people turning 100 or older. And as that happens and the younger generations have kind of dispersed, maybe they don't stay in the same areas, or the older generations move to a warmer climate, such as me down here in Florida, and the taxes help too, of course. The reality is the level of contact, especially with social media, you see what's going on in your family's lives, but you might not engage with them as much. And one of your closest confidants ends up being your financial advisor. They know the ins and outs of all those topics, especially when it comes to money and the family dynamics, that the rest of the family doesn't know. And so hopefully that good advisor is making that full circle, not just to retain assets afterwards for the next generation, but to genuinely do a good job in making sure that that transfer is what the client wanted, and helping with that family cohesion so that in-laws don't become outlaws is something I talk about in the book, and avoiding those missteps.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the topic of family. It's obviously a big inspiration for the book. And I mean, if the sort of, the grinded out kind of gradual millionaires that you seem to be talking about, I think by and large, not entirely, but we're talking mostly about family business owners. And that's how they're going to sort of come up with that money in some way or not. Mm-hmm. So, obviously family is part of that. It's a very large part of that. So, do you mind talking a bit about how, so as an advisor, you're sort of navigating these family issues that can arise when, say, you have your client is sort of bridging the gap between, the old country that, they're guilty that they're sort of leaving behind, and then the new country, which is, their kids who are sort of growing up with, unheard of things that previous generations couldn't even dreamt of.
Yeah. So, everybody dreams of their kids getting into the family business. I would love for my own daughters to, become financial advisors, financial planners, and take over my practice one day. When they were little, they'd play around in the office. So we have pictures of that, and that'd be a great social media post down the road if they ever come into business. But the reality is they're finding their own footing. They're setting their own stage and their own goals. And I'm going to support them in whatever they decided to choose and go into. Similar with my dad, he got into restaurants initially. Eventually he got into real estate. Neither path was one that I chose. And I think there was some level of disappointment in that because he found that to be an area where he'd like, to pass that on. So I think there's a natural inclination to want that. But I also think that in every family dynamic, you're going to have, it's rare now to have generation after generation taking over businesses. I think the workforce today, it's very innovative. It's different. I think the younger generations tend to get a bad name for the fact that they're disloyal. But the reality is, no, they want to be inspired. And if they're no longer inspired, they're okay and feel okay with pivoting. So they're okay with taking another position, changing or taking another job or starting their own job or their own industry. And so, when it comes to family dynamics, I think there's a respect that has to be had for that. And so how do you still keep the family cohesive? How do you still use your wealth then to create family legacy and meaningful conversations and meaningful experiences? And we talk about that. I reference another author's work too about this idea with memory dividends and the payout that affords. So using your wealth not just to accumulate stuff and become a hoarder of things, because you can't take the U-Haul behind the hearse, right? It doesn't make any sense. But you can carry on a legacy that lasts generations from experiences that you've had. And so we see that a lot more with clients, that they're using their wealth to create experiences, to sponsor the family reunions and the gatherings and the outings and cruises or whatever it may be, in order to do that, as opposed to just having more stuff to give or even more wealth to give. It's not squandering it. It's tying the family in. And so we talk a little bit in the book as well about creating that, but also creating some kind of governance and some kind of legacy around whether if you're charitably inclined and there's an organization you want to be a part of, bringing the family into that, and how can you explore that together? How can you immerse yourself in those things and instill the values that you still want passed on to the generation? Use your wealth as a way to amplify that, perhaps, but don't use your wealth as a means to lord it over somebody or just to, again, accumulate and pass on more stuff. Because the funny thing is, when estates are fought over, a lot of the times, it's not the highest value items, but it's the heirlooms, right? It's the things that might not have any monetary value or much monetary value, but it's the thing that, this one signifies that I was mom or dad's favorite. And that's what they're arguing over, these little things.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to bring up. I love, Robin Williams' family, when they had their, sort of brief fight over his estate. It wasn't over his, tens of millions of dollars. It was over his bicycle collection, and which I'm sure was, worth several $100,000. I'm sure they're plenty nice, the bicycles, but in the grand scheme of things, they identified that as something that represented him. And that's what they cared about, rather than, X number of zeros behind the dollar amount they were getting.
Couldn't agree more. You're right.
So, you brought up philanthropy here, and this, idea of sort of trying to use that as a tool to, bring the generations together, or sort of to instill certain values. You mind expanding on that idea a little bit?
Yeah, it can be whatever, right? So obviously there's the religious context that a lot of families use, but it can also be, we see it all the time, your alma mater, and passing that on, whether it's they attended it or they support through the boosters programs or whatever it may be, or just a cause that you believe in. And it's not just about the vanity of putting your name on the wall, all that kind of stuff, but genuinely putting yourself in a position to actually join in, do family activities together that help collaborate and do these. So if you're going to support the Alzheimer's organization, go on the walk as a family too. Sure, you can make your donation. You can make sure that you take full advantage of whether it's a family foundation or a donor advised fund or whatever, and get all the tax benefits and the estate tax benefits and all those kind of things in the planning sphere. But also make sure that you're bringing your kids along the way and experiencing it so they can know what you stood for, what you're about at the end of the day. And, as you're moving from the old world state of things to the new world state of things, know that one of the greatest assets that you have is not just your money, but your time. Anybody on their deathbed that could buy another year of their life, what would they spend to do that? Well, make the best use of it while you have it today. So create those experiences. And sometimes that just means outsourcing some things, whether, my father, for instance, has a real hard time when I go on a vacation, and we grew up going to the same exact spots where we owned property. We would go there, and that's it. You didn't go on a vacation and rent a house from somebody through Airbnb. It didn't exist at the time, but we certainly weren't going to spend it on a hotel, anything like that. It was just something you went to those locations. That was it. And that became the bond. Whereas, in my family, my generation with my kids, we go and we're okay spending it, because I look at owning those additional properties as another time suck, another obligation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that ruins it. So it depends on the mentality of the family, how they're going to deploy capital. And it's okay. My dad, for the longest time, couldn't understand the idea of me hiring somebody to cut my lawn, even, any of those kind of things. But why would I ruin an entire weekend when something that, for the cost of not even a meal out with my family can allow me to enjoy the entire day with them? In that case, so happy to make that trade-off. And I think it goes to even our value proposition. Sure, could people do it themselves? Could they do things? But the headaches, the stressors, et cetera, and not knowing what you don't know, not having that expertise, there's a lot of value added as an advisor. And we talk about that in the book as well, as to what an advisor should be doing, how they should do it, but also a real quantifiable value. We cite the Vanguard Advisors Alpha study in there in the book, and kind of level setting with that, because there's a lot of misnomers, a lot of podcasts, a lot of brother-in-laws, et cetera, out there that think they know better than to work with an advisor. And some of the intangibles out there of behavioral side of things, of creating these teams, creating conversations with family, et cetera, hard to quantify. The book attempts to do so by referencing such studies and bringing it back into a meaningful way that the reader can experience and seek out.
Yeah, it's the great challenge, right, with moving out of just the numbers on a spreadsheet investment role into that more holistic, emotional, what my lifetime relationship with my family and money is sort of role, is that it becomes harder and harder to demonstrate the value, sort of, to show the client, in a way, like physically, that you've demonstrated it. And you can't just hand them sort of like a graph of like, how much financial education they've had, or how much closer their family is now than before, or how much more involved their children are, right? In the same way that you could with saying like, well, your investments are doing better. But now the role has expanded so much, it becomes harder and harder for advisors to sort of demonstrate that tangible value to, even if they're providing it, it's hard to show it to the client.
And I think the firms out there, lots of advisors are trying to, by offering family pricing, all that kind of stuff, to bring the next generation in. But I think also we need to recognize the fact that their estate tells a story, and we have to. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned in the book, what story will your estate will it tell? And so if your kids inherit your estate because the first time they've really dug into any of your wealth or understood what you had is when they see a statement and they're, showing IDs to claim on their POD or TODs for beneficiary accounts, then it just becomes numbers to them. And This is just a windfall, which means it gets typically spent and just blown. Whereas if they understand the work that led to it, the story behind it, and the tactical thinking and the relationship they have with the advisor and all the thoughts and that went into it, it now becomes, okay, this is the family legacy that we're managing. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to involve an entire foundation or a construct of a trust and tied up with things or having to be ruled from the grave. It's a whole lot better with the carrot when they see the prudence and the wisdom behind managing their money wisely. And I think that's probably the biggest miss from generation to generation, and why many families don't continue on to be, the Rockefellers or whatever the modern day example would be.
Yeah, I like that idea of using the story, particularly because stories are meant to be interpreted, right? I think a lot of times when you're talking about family values, especially passing on values, people confuse values with rules pretty often. And then rules are so as a lawyer, I especially feel like rules are meant not to be broken, right? They tell you exactly what to do. And family values, it's not really the same thing, right? Where, too many times I've seen, heard from advisors where, they weren't happy with the clients weren't happy enough having raised philanthropically inclined kids. They were upset with their kids because they weren't philanthropically inclined in the exact same causes that the parents were. And that's, I think, at that point, you're sort of following the family rule of being we donate to cancer research, where it's like, well, maybe, your kids don't have that same, they're very philanthropic. They want to donate to AIDS research, or they want to donate to, getting rid of food deserts and fighting hunger. But you've gotten the important part of the value you've passed on. And then sort of, I think that's a valuable way to think of it, is like that you got the gist of the story, right? You don't get lost in sort of the minutia of it.
Well, I agree.
So that is about all the time that we have for today's episode. I would like to thank George Stefanou for being a really great guest and for talking about a topic that, kind of comes up a lot on this show, but we very rarely, we haven't actually devoted a show to it. So I was really happy to have the opportunity to sort of sit down and sort of talk about the sort of first generation millionaire issues and sort of what they go through, because it kind of comes up for a couple of minutes every show. So thanks so much for coming on, George.
Thank you, David, for having me.
And the book is To Comma Wealth: Investment, Tax, and Estate Strategies to Consider When Your Net Worth Exceeds $1 million. For all our listeners, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of WealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.